It's a day of celebration in the State of Israel. 3 female hostages have been returned. Those 3 female hostages are Romi Gonen, age 24, Emily Damari, age 28, and Doron Steinbrecher, aged 31, all of whom were kidnapped on that dreadful day of October the 7th, 2023, by Hamas terrorists who stormed into Israel, murdered 1,200 of our people, and kidnapped 252 into the Gaza Strip. So this is a day of celebration in the State of Israel. The released hostages have been handed from the hands of the black-clad terrorists, the primitive, savage individuals who have been holding them in captivity inside the dungeons of the Gaza Strip for all of this period since October the 7th. And it's important to express that this deal is one that really compounds the tremendous, tremendous cost that was exacted against innocent Israelis on October the 7th, and every day since then, when Hamas massacred our men, our women, and our children and took our loved ones hostage. But it's important to emphasize that the return of these hostages, and hopefully all of the hostages, will help to heal a collective national and even international heart that has really been harmed and injured for far too long, and that would never be whole without these hostages coming home. Well, I think I speak for everybody in Israel and everybody beyond the borders of Israel who cares for the state and the people of Israel when I say that there is absolutely unbridled, indescribable levels of jubilation that's coursing through my veins when I see these 3 young women who have been held captive for so very long being returned from the Gaza Strip to the State of Israel. I note 2 particular points. Number 1, that the Israel Defense Forces and the people of Israel will never relent from the work to bring our people home. We will not leave our people behind. We will continue to pursue all avenues and to attempt all ways and all means in order to make whole our society. And it's a society that would not be whole in the continued absence of our hostages, and is still not whole, given that there are so many hostages that remain inside the Gaza Strip. The remainder of the initial 33 hostages, of course, the 30 that remain who are scheduled to be released during the initial 42 days, phase 1 of this hostage release deal, are yet to come home. And then there are more beyond that number, of course. So unbridled jubilation and celebration and thanks for the fact that our hostages, 3 of them, have come home today. But of course, Israel has been thrust into a completely macabre lottery wherein for 6 weeks, we will receive 3 to 4 hostages each week without necessarily knowing if they are alive, what state of mind they're in, what state they're in physically, and of course, not knowing until 24 hours prior to their return to Israel which of the hostages will be coming home. So this is an awful game into which Hamas has thrust the people of Israel. A back and forth with a terror organization, Hamas, to bring home Israel's hostages from inside the Gaza Strip to the Jewish state. And there are so many things that could go wrong during the course of this initial 42-day period, that 42-day period that is phase 1 of the hostage deal. And within the family members of hostages, there are, of course, those family members whose hostages are what are called men of age. Men of age are those essentially designated falsely by Hamas as being enemy combatants simply due to their age and their gender. So that's between the age of 18 and approximately 50. Those men of age, and there are many of them who were taken hostage by Hamas on October the 7th, they are in the final stage of any deal. So the tension, the suffering, the distress of their family members will endure and will continue until all of these hostages are brought home. I think that Israelis and the Israeli government will be anticipating that every trick, every connivance will be used by Hamas in order to ramp up the level of psychological terror and torture that they're able to wield against the people of Israel. I believe very, very strongly, and I think that, again, I speak for everybody within Israel when I say this, that the word of Hamas cannot be accepted until that which they say they will deliver, namely our hostages to our people, until that process has been completed. I think that we're likely to see Hamas wrestle to improve the terms of this hostage release deal until the moment that the hostages are reunited with the Israeli security forces. I think that the fact that they will not yet declare which of the hostages are alive and which are not, what state they are in and what state they are not, all of that is indicative of the fact that Hamas is going to play this game, this dreadful game, for as long as it possibly can. And I think that we should expect that they will seek to extract more of their prisoners, more terrorists from Israeli jails as the end of this process, this 42-day process, draws close. And it's important that your viewers understand the distinction between the society of Israel and the society that is there inside the Gaza Strip. I want to give you just a couple of things to think about. Who does Israel want to have released in addition to the three who have thankfully come home today? Well, we want to see the release and the return of Ariel Bibas, who was 4 years of age when he was kidnapped from inside Israel. We want to see the release of Kfir Bibas, who was 9 months of age when he was kidnapped. We want to see the release of his parents, Yarden and Shiri, 34 and 33, respectively. This is a family that was kidnapped in its entirety and remains in the dungeons of the Gaza Strip to this day. They caused no harm, no foul to anybody. They were kidnapped, and the entire Israeli society has lived through psychological torture since that very day. Who does Hamas want to see returned? They want to see Ibrahim Hamed. Hamed was the mastermind behind approximately 90% of the homicide bombing attacks that took place during the events of the Second Intifada between 2000 and 2005, including the most severe homicide bombings. He was a hunted man by the Israeli security forces since 1998. Who else does Hamas want to see brought back to their society? They want to see people like Abbas al-Sayed brought home to them. He was the principal planner of the 2002 Passover massacre in Netanya, the coastal city in northern Israel. That individual was sentenced to 35 life terms for the murder of Israelis. So Israelis want our men, women, and infant children home. Who does Hamas want? It wants murderers, psychopaths, terrorists that any normal society would, quite frankly, vomit out from within its midst, not inside the Gaza Strip. These are the people that Hamas want to come home. And how do you know that it's such a very, very sick society inside Gaza? Not by the actions exclusively of Hamas, those are to be anticipated, but you know it by the actions of the masses. Today, when you have seen the return of these three hostages, these three female hostages, you see that Hamas are feted and applauded by hundreds and even thousands of Gazans around them, surrounding that scene. And such was the case on October the 7th, when our hostages were first taken. Not only did you see their abductors celebrating in triumph, but you saw throngs of Gazans by the hundreds and by the thousands celebrating this act of depravity. And that is why the Gazan people must forever be kept away from the borders of the state of Israel. They cannot be allowed to return to the border of the state of Israel. They cannot be allowed to live proximate to the borders of the state of Israel, because it's from among the civilian population that Hamas operatives are recruited, readily so, and it's from within the civilian population that Hamas operates in order to bring harm and death and torture and the abduction of Israel's innocent civilians. The question of whether or not the truce between Israel and Hamas inside the Gaza Strip will hold is very complex. It's complex on a tactical level. It's also complex on a strategic level. Let's start with the strategic level first of all. if there is a ceasefire deal between the Israel Defense Forces and Hamas, can those in league with Hamas also be expected to hang fire? I'm referring to organizations such as the Houthis in Yemen. Are they going to be implicated when it comes to the responsibility to uphold this ceasefire deal? They claim, after all, in part, to be rocketing Israel in solidarity with the Gazan people and with Hamas. Is Iran implicated when it comes to responsibility for ensuring that this ceasefire deal holds, or will Iran be able to continue its malign activities? Hezbollah, up in the north of Israel, inside southern Lebanon, has been massively downgraded by the bravery and the operational courage and triumph of the Israel Defense Forces, but it still exists. And Hezbollah, on October the 8th, after October 7th, 2023, just a day after, perhaps 2 days after, tied its fate to Gaza and said that it would continue to rocket Israel as long as the IDF operated inside the Gaza Strip. Is Hezbollah going to be implicated in hanging its fire when it comes to the ceasefire deal that has been struck? So those are on the slightly larger level. On the more local level, I think that it is a very, very fraught ceasefire agreement. I'll give you some examples of it. Right now, the Israel Defense Forces is expected to withdraw from much of the Netzarim corridor. The Netzarim corridor is that which bifurcates north from south Israel. It begins approximately on the Gazan side of the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip, roughly in the area of Kibbutz Be'eri, and it runs all the way over to the west coast of the Gaza Strip, to the Mediterranean, specifically to an area where the Americans were seeking to establish an aid pier earlier on in the war, to a base that's known as Jalot. That artery is of critical importance to the Israel Defense Forces for supplies, for munitions, for the siphoning and cycling in and out of our soldiers. And we are now, the members of the Israel Defense Forces, expected to withdraw from that area. Now, taking up our place in that area is expected to be an international force, but not from a military force, from a private security company led by Americans who are expected to carry out checks, security checks on Gazans now permitted under the terms of this deal to move from southern Gaza back to the area of the northern Gaza Strip. If we see that such checks are not effectively undertaken, if we see the retrenchment of terrorists and terror activities inside the northern Gaza Strip that bring a threat towards Israel's citizens inside Israel, we are very likely to see the IDF operating in areas it is expected to be withdrawn from. Incidentally, I think it is a dreadful error to outsource the security of our hard-fought areas, those that we now hold inside the Gaza Strip, to an American security, private security force, but such are the terms of the deal. On the other side, there has been much talk about as withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor. That is the area in the southern Gaza Strip that is adjacent to the northern Sinai Peninsula, which is Egyptian territory. Now, it's from that corridor that we saw the movement out of the Gaza Strip over many, many years into the Sinai Peninsula, and then those who left the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Peninsula would travel up towards Lebanon, into Syria, over to Iraq, into Iran. They would receive training and sometimes munitions from the Iranians, and then they would retread that very same route. So go from Iran into Iraq, into Syria, over to Lebanon, back down to the Sinai Peninsula, and then into the Gaza Strip through the Philadelphia corridor. So that porous border is the border that was exploited by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And it's as a result of that that much of the know-how and the weaponry and the tactics that were employed by them during the massacre of October the 7th, it's through that porous border that all of those things, many of those things, arrived inside the Gaza Strip. So the Israel Defense Forces is saying it is going to remain entrenched along the Philadelphia corridor, contrary to many, many reports. This is an insistence of Prime Minister Netanyahu. But I believe that those two areas, the presence of the Israel Defense Forces along the Philadelphia corridor, combined with the purported absence or withdrawal of the Israel Defense Forces along the Netzarim corridor, what actually takes place there could disrupt a deal and could end up bringing about a torpedoing of the ceasefire. As an individual who has served in the Israel Defense Forces, including during the course of this war, inside the Gaza Strip, as someone whose siblings have served in the Israel Defense Forces, and as someone who's had the high privilege of serving alongside those heroes that I was honored to work alongside and to serve alongside, I want to say that we must all take a moment to thank, to acknowledge, and to celebrate the courage of the members of the Israel Defense Forces and to recall the sacrifice of our men and women. 400 members of the Israel Defense Forces have fallen in the battle to bring our hostages home, to bring our hostages home. Also in the battle to bring Hamas to its knees, but most importantly, to bring our hostages home. And those fallen soldiers, they are in my heart, my mind, and in the collective prayers of all the house of Israel on this day. I also think that it's very important that people understand that there is now going to be an enormous battle for hearts and minds throughout the international community, and it is going to be waged through traditional media and new media. And anybody who cares for the state and the people of Israel must understand that they can take a direct role in that battle. Let me express why. Now that the Gazan people are able to move northward into northern Gaza, there are going to be images that emanate of the distraction inside northern Gaza. I have operated in that area inside northern Gaza, and I can tell you that the distraction there is very extensive. But as extensive as it is equally justified and justifiable, and it is entirely the result of the fact that Hamas brought about an infrastructure in that area wherein the Israel Defense Forces would have to operate from among and within civilian populations. It brought the response and the reaction of the Israel Defense Forces about as a direct consequence of launching the most horrific massacre of the Jewish people since the events of the Holocaust. Now, when those images come out, people need to remember that context. They need to understand how this has come about, and they need to speak out and speak up and encourage others to do the same when it comes to showing solidarity with a society and a civilization that is very similar indeed to the standards that Europeans and Americans hold dear to themselves, namely the state of Israel. And they must force people to understand by force of argument the juxtaposition between the virtues of Israel as it fights to preserve its society versus the depravity of Hamas as it fights to bring down Western values, including those values that are held dear in the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and throughout much of Europe. Everybody can put their shoulder to the wheel in the course of this media battle, and I hope that they'll do so.